Smac, can you please introduce yourself? Tell us more about how did you get into crypto? What do you do at Compound? And we can then kind of just dig deeper into things from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it. Yeah, I guess I'll give you kind of like a quick background on how I got into crypto and then a little bit about us and how we operate at Compound. I mean, I always find it fascinating hearing other people's stories of how they got into this space, whether it's like founders or other investors or builders. So my journey, I guess, started in 2015. So I had a background in structured credit trading in traditional finance and knew relatively quickly that I didn't want to do that forever, but wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And incidentally, had a roommate who at the time traded foreign exchange at another bank, and people on his desk started talking about this digital currency, Bitcoin. And so a little bit fortuitous, he kind of introduced me to it, sent me the white paper. I read it, didn't really get it. Seemed kind of interesting, like, okay, peer-to-peer payments, whatever. And then for me, I always viewed him as kind of like my smartest, very intelligent friend. And so a couple months later, he told me he was moving to Hong Kong, quitting his job and running capital markets for Hong Kong exchange. And so I was like, wow, okay, he's serious about this stuff. I'm going to spend some more time looking at it. And yeah, I read the Ethereum white paper and then really kind of fell down the rabbit hole at that point and just was spending all my time at my desk reading, printing out white papers and reading them. And yeah, very quickly realized, told my boss, like, hey, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. So that was kind of how I got into crypto. Yeah, that's a little bit about, at least how I initially got into the space. I can talk a bit, like Compound I joined relatively recently. And that was really through conversations I had with Mike Dempsey over the last couple of years. I was always a lurker on Twitter and didn't really tweet until COVID. And it was like everybody's stuck inside. So started tweeting a little bit more about the things I thought about crypto and started writing a bit more. And Mike and I started talking. I talked to a couple other places. I always found like the way Compound approached things very interesting, unique, and like they were extremely thoughtful. I appreciated that relative to a lot of other people in the space. I mean, over time we kind of talked and eventually it was like, hey, it would be great to help them build out their crypto investing because they've been involved, we've been involved actually since 2016. And yeah, I think that they did, they've spent a lot of time in the space, think about it a lot and just wanted to do more. And so, yeah, that was kind of how I ended up there.
Nice. That's really interesting. I think the TradFi to the DeFi pipeline and somebody who kind of embodies that DeFi culture and even Web3 for that matter, very deeply. I have deep appreciation for that. And you mentioned that Compound has a different approach or a rather unique approach to this whole space and even investing in general. Please tell us more about that. Maybe Compound's thesis as well. How do you view crypto as a fund?
Yeah, it's very unique. So Compound, like really, we're very research centric and thesis driven, and so we're investing kind of at the earliest stages where a lot of times it's like, hey, what do we need to believe versus what do we need to know? And so I know a lot of these things like firms claim now that they take this approach, but really like the way we express it is essentially publishing lots of research, writing often about the areas that we're interested in, making our ideas available through like a public thesis database that we update kind of periodically as our views mature or they evolve or they change. And I think that's kind of the right way to approach these types of spaces where you have like deeply technical, science-driven areas. The future is pretty unclear, but I think the right way and the way that we do it at Compound is like, hey, this is like what we believe and how we see the future shaping. And like, these are the inflection points within technology or like macro or all of these different things that matter. Like, how are they coming together? And like, what are the areas where lots of different kind of confluence is happening. And so, especially within crypto, I think it's very easy to kind of get caught up in like, hey, what are people talking about today? And like, what's like the hot narrative? I think the way we approach it, it's good in the sense that like, look, we see that there's a lot of noise going on, and like our view is it's important to hear what people are saying, but also like we're investors for very long periods, like multi-year, long time frame, decade thinking. And so it's like that stuff is more noise in our view. And so like we have to have our own individual perspectives. And I just think that that's very different from a lot of other firms. That's really what drew me to Compound in the first place, actually. And yeah, to give a little more color on Compound, is like crypto is one of the verticals that we invest in, and really where I spend almost all of my time. And the others are really kind of also deeply technical or science driven areas. So I would categorize them as like automation, which is, we think of as AI, ML, and robotics. And then the other major category is healthcare and bio, which is, I would say like digital health through biotech. And so they're different areas, but I think in some cases they're going to overlap in the future. And I think it's actually very good to have these different perspectives, because I think people can get a bit too narrow focused when they're spending, all of their time in these echo bubbles within each of these different areas.
I think one of the key points that you spoke about was a lot of noise being a very constant state in crypto, right? And there is this idea of a lot of narratives coming one after the next, and people jumping from one story to the next. So there is a very tricky challenge both for founders and investors to be navigating this narrative rotation. How do you think about parsing that complexity, and even kind of digging deeper into what's worth looking at and what's going to be fickle and will probably fade away with time?
It's a great question. That's really one of the things we think about all the time, is kind of like, what does the future look like? And over longer time periods, like how do we think the world changes? And so like I will say part of the genesis of the piece we wrote on like a crypto future was essentially, it was inspired by actually something that Mike had sent all of us at Compound that another researcher had done a few years ago for the AI space. And it was really like, hey, there are these very high level kind of ambiguous narratives within AI, and in our case within crypto. And like, that's fine, but I think the forcing function of writing in extreme detail, like how do we think this industry evolves and how does it impact our future over the coming years, it really forces you to kind of make decisions about like, what do I actually think? So it's quite easy, in my opinion, to like read something and say, no, that's not going to happen, but then like the question is, okay, but what do you think will happen? And so really the forcing function of writing in detail, like, hey, this is probably not what actually will happen, but at this moment in time, with all the information we have, like, this is what I think is the most realistic future. And then you kind of condition, okay, if this is the most realistic future for the following 12 months, let's say this is all correct, then what does the future look like the following year? And so it's I think a good thought exercise, and like very useful just internally with our thinking of like parsing our ideas, getting feedback from people like, hey, I don't think this is realistic because of X, Y, and Z. And so then it's like, okay, I can spend more time like learning about this thing that maybe I don't know enough about. And so that kind of like detail of thinking, I think, at least in my opinion, it helps avoid kind of chasing whatever the hot narrative is, because lots of times like these early stage companies take a long time to navigate the idea maze, find product market fit, like ship a product that people want. And so when you see things working, oftentimes like those teams have been building for a long time before you even hear about them. And so just looking at what people are talking about today is not the best. Yeah, I just don't find it the best use of like mental energy. Like, it's important to know, but really we need to be thinking like much further out into the future.
That answer really makes sense, right? Having a detailed, perhaps, picture that you paint either through writing or your form of expression, where you want to talk about, okay, maybe this is what I think the future will look like. and then trying to fit what comes your way into that narrative, maybe using that information to evolve that vision for the future, and then building on top of that. I think after all, what we end up realizing is in a space which is seemingly complex, perhaps doing the simple things is the hardest.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to be fair, it also is like very useful for like expressing your opinions in public. Oftentimes, I forget what the phrase is, but it's like people very quickly tell you why you're like dumb or wrong if you just express opinions. It's like, okay, that may be useful of this person's going to tell me all the reasons I'm wrong. And so great, like I can like spend time figuring out things that I didn't know, which if you're kind of just in your own head and not really publicly expressing these things or writing, like maybe you never develop a better sense of like the nuance of these things that you're thinking about.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I think after I read the whole piece, when I started making my notes, there were a few ideas for builders and founders that stood out to me in that discussion. One of the things that he spoke about was UX improvements, and you spoke about traversing the chain needs to be much more simpler than what it is today. Can you please expand on that?
Yeah, I think this is still certainly a problem within crypto, is just like the bar to people who have no experience with it entering is still like far too high, and it's unrealistic to expect to have millions more users with the current kind of UX experience that we have. And so one of those things is like, how do people who haven't touched crypto ever, don't really have any experience, aren't going to set up a wallet or these things, like how do they start to learn about what's going on chain, right? And so to me, on-chain search, like really good UI UX for on-chain search is going to be, in my opinion, like an unlock for people. I mentioned like gaming wasn't going to be the unlock just because I think that the development of games takes so much longer than people think. And so I actually think on-chain search is much closer than people realize. We've seen teams building, iterations of this and like, hey, how do we make it more friendly for people to kind of just like search the same way they would on Google? Like, hey, I want to see like what activity is going on in NFTs, or I want to see like what tokens are trading on Uniswap, or I want to see like, hey, what are these wallets doing? And showing the, whether it's visual representations or like abstracting away a lot of the kind of noise that you see on Etherscan or some of the block explorers today, abstracting that away for like thinking about, okay, if I told my mom to like go look stuff up on chain, like she has no way to do that today. And I just think about like that type of user. And obviously, maybe it's not going to be my mom, it's going to be somebody younger, but like you still need to think of users who are not used to using Etherscan or using block explorers and like searching contract addresses. And so when search becomes easier, I think it becomes a lot simpler for new people to explore like what's actually happening. And so obviously there need to be like applications that people want to use. And today there's not a lot of those, but that to me is kind of like more of an inevitable thing. And you really want users to have their first experience be like, hey, I can see what's going on, not, oh, this is like awful and like screw this, I'm not using anything on chain, I don't like, this is ridiculous, I feel like it's 25 years ago.
Yeah, we've seen a few projects on Buildso that kind of try to create a social feed out of what's happening on chain, and it's like and this project that I'm talking about, particular, the strategy was to go mobile first, and be like, okay, think of this as an Instagram, but all your on-chain activity becomes much more simplified and easier to read, and that's something that kind of was pretty exciting. And their choice to go mobile first as well. So this intersection of crypto and mobile is something that you also kind of talk about. Do you see some intersection between the UX improvements that you're talking about and then more broadly crypto and mobile?
Yeah, absolutely. So the future is certainly not desktop. Like we've already kind of moved away. Like we've moved from desktop to mobile. for a lot of other things. And so like we need crypto is going to need to be usable on mobile. A world in which crypto only exists on desktop is like the universe of users is tiny in that world. And so we're going to need mobile applications. And yeah, I mean, my sense is that will come. To be honest, that's one of the things that I thought was interesting about Solana, like launching a phone, was just like they're clearly at least thinking about a future in which like, hey, can we do things natively on mobile on crypto rails? And like that is super interesting to me. I mean, you saw the Google news yesterday or the day before. I think it's tough to tell when some of the gatekeepers for mobile will make it a little more palatable for crypto. But I think like there's enough, like the Uniswap app, there's enough happening with like bigger protocols or projects where it's more of like a matter of when, not if. Personally, I don't think like Apple will be taxing 30% of like crypto transactions and NFTs. Like, I don't know. I just don't, I think there'll be enough kind of social and like political pressure around that at some point. I don't know when that is, like the timing matters. I just think it's unrealistic to expect to only be using desktop. And so, maybe it's not this year or next year, maybe it's further down the road, but I think teams and builders should definitely be thinking about like, okay, if I'm building an application today on desktop, like what does this look like on mobile? Like what is our plan for bringing this to mobile? I just think it's inevitable that it moves there. It's just kind of a question of timing. And so, one approach is what Solana's doing with the Saga. That's interesting and different. We'll see if that's kind of like the right approach, but we can't exist in a world in which everything's being done on desktop.
I resonate with what you said, right? I think there is always this approach where you either build the entire stack on their own, something similar to what Solana is doing, where you have your own app store, you have your own hardware and everything. Whereas something like the Google news that came 2 days ago, for those who don't know, they basically incorporated NFTs being a part of games and other services in the Play Store policy, and it was basically allowed. So this kind of opened up a lot of floodgates to can open up actually a lot of floodgates to users actually being able to use NFTs through apps which have massive distribution through the Play Store.
One last thing I would say around that is just too, when you're thinking about like validator distribution and running like light clients on mobile, that's also like a big deal. And so as we see that, like that's an important thing that over time, I think you'll see, many more light clients. We can run things on mobile, or you can do distributed compute and storage at some point, like on local devices. Like unlocking that, I think has pretty massive implications over time. And so, that's just kind of like another avenue of why I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think we had Omar here for our first session as well, and we spent some time talking about light clients being one of those very easy ways to get people excited about some of the infra as well. And light clients running on phones is a personal favorite of mine as well. So I'm definitely excited about that space and being able to verify activity on chain. I want to tie a thread back to our initial topic about the UX improvements when you want to traverse on-chain data, right? A question from Alex Lumley here kind of echoes my thoughts as well. He put a question in the chat. I'm talking about, well, if you want to, even if there are UX improvements to kind of how can you view, let's say, the block explorer, still for a normie, so to speak, or somebody who's not Web3 native, why would they still be caring about these on-chain activities? Just because I can now read that Jared from Subway spent 200 ETH on gas in the last 3 days. That probably is still not the most relevant piece of data for somebody who's a retail user. So how do you see this UX improvement being one of those on-ramps for mass adoption?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. I think we have to think like beyond what what exists today on chain, because I think, look, if you are aware of crypto and like interested in it over the last couple of years, you've likely tried to use the apps, tried to like use Uniswap or Aave or Compound. You've try to use Etherscan to look at like what's going on and what wallets are doing. And so I think the whole idea behind like, why would my mom, for example, care about things on chain today? Like she definitely wouldn't. Like she couldn't care less about what's happening on chain today, which is fine. Like the idea here, I think, is like, or the fundamental idea here is like, it's a thesis of like self-sovereignty around lots of different systems. And so that can be financial systems, it can be healthcare systems, it can be education systems.
Yeah.
And to me, like the natural first sector that's touched here is financial systems, right? Especially as you think about like the genesis of Bitcoin, Satoshi's vision coming out of the heels of like the great financial crisis, right? And so I think it's natural that the first wave of this stuff is financially motivated. And so there's not a ton of stuff outside of that to look at today, right? And so I think we need to be thinking, okay, what about in the next year or two? Will there be social applications that people are using? And will there be things within like energy, distributed energy, for example, that people are using or care about? And so when I say like on-chain search, I think you don't want to turn people away and have their first experience be awful, because like very often those people don't come back. So my basic thesis here is like, there will definitely be more things on chain than financial speculation at some point, right? And so if I use that as kind of a baseline thinking, I need it to be like usable and searchable for people in that future world. And so like today it's financial speculation. There's like stable coins are a huge use case. But I think that like, look, if you're in this space and thinking about it long term, you're obviously bullish on like lots of other applications. But the point, like, I think it's a completely fair question of like, hey, what would they want to look at today? And there's not a lot of things that my parents are interested in looking at on chain today.
Maybe perhaps talking about the things that may be interesting to look at on chain today, and you touched upon them in your explanation, where there may be perhaps more verticals beyond financial speculation that come on chain, which could probably be interesting to a larger and larger audience. One of those ideas that you spoke about was healthcare. And I've seen Compound's portfolio, and if you look at it, you have investments across biotech as well, and you are investors in some of the most evolved decentralized science projects like VitaDAO, Molecule DAO. You also talk about DeSci as being one of the underdogs, so to speak, or at least most of the mainstream crypto crowd seems to be fading DeSci right now, which you are particularly excited about. Please enlighten us on what are your thoughts on DeSci?
Yeah, we think it's like super interesting. One, because the like healthcare markets are massive, and they're also like they suffer from a lot of things that crypto rails and like open source software we think can fix. And so Shelby, who is one of the investors at Compound, spends a ton of time just like focused on healthcare and like that space broadly. And so I think we are in a unique position at Compound of like having a very deep understanding of the healthcare space, but also crypto. And so I think a lot of times there's nuance to understanding the problems that exist. And so if you don't understand the nuance of like, hey, these are like the issues with data collection within healthcare broadly or within different verticals in healthcare, then it's hard to like understand how crypto rails or how open source software or how machine learning can actually solve some of these things. And so, I mean, one of the huge problems is like data, like siloed data within healthcare. And so like there's lots of duplicative work being done, lots of research being done in parallel that, incomplete data sets and like data that should be shared that maybe isn't. And I think there's a lot of reasons why like crypto technology, both Rails, but also kind of like when you think about like permissionless and like privacy enabled data, like there's lots of reasons why that can unlock like huge step function leaps in health outcomes. And so it's like, it's it's like I think difficult and like complicated problems, but it's super exciting to us because like we see it both within crypto and within healthcare. And so like I think our view is kind of, it's an inevitability that some of these things will be solved. It's just a matter of like, hey, can we get crypto people and can we get healthcare doctors or researchers to kind of like cross-pollinate and understand like how these things can be leveraged, because our view is like there you can really improve health outcomes, which is like obviously net beneficial beyond like building big companies, right? And so that's important to us, and like it ties in very deeply to the idea of like decentralized storage as well. And so like there's a lot of things there that we think are super interesting, and our view is kind of, hey, like we should be working with founders and teams who are trying to build in like these adjacent spaces, because we feel like we're uniquely enabled to help these types of teams.
Exactly. And I think for more specific context, can you drill down on the problem of fragmented or like having centralized your health data in centralized repositories? How do health data silos or like maybe data DAOs, so to speak, can be breakthrough use of blockchain technology to further advance, research in genomics and the spaces that are that rely on a lot of enriched health data.
So I think like one thing just that's kind of like across all of these things is the idea of like privacy, right? And so I think you see more and more people, I mean, there's tons of studies and tons of data that suggest like people's trust in systems has just continued to degrade since like the 70s and is kind of degrading more rapidly over the last decade. And so privacy of data, especially healthcare data, is something that I think more and more people care about and will continue to care about. And so protecting that data is important. Being able to like verify that data is anonymized or is hidden is super important. And when you think about like data DAOs, or even kind of like research funding, right? So that's like one of the difficult things that Molecule DAO and Vita DAO are working on as well, is just, hey, how do we fund things that maybe are not being funded by like massive healthcare organizations today? And you get like a very good social coordination around people who are motivated to solve these problems, right? So whether it's people with like a rare disease, for example, who are willing to provide data and participate, whereas like giant healthcare providers aren't interested in funding that type of stuff. And so you just have like very good social coordination mechanisms, and like the funding mechanisms are much better, where you can get potentially breakthrough like healthcare outcomes that you might otherwise not have had, because the like resources of the data and the actual funding for those types of things just never kind of gets off the ground. And especially, I mean, the last point I'll make about that is just, right, crypto is like truly global. And so, just the distribution of healthcare data, I think really opens up a lot of like, I don't know the right way to say this, but like the pool of candidates for all of these different things is much larger when you're talking about like a truly global network, which crypto is. And yeah, I think that there's just like huge opportunities there.
Really exciting. I think so. Essentially a combination of privacy, more efficient coordination primitives, as a function of having distributed networks, at the same time being able to reach a global audience for the set data and managing it in the right way, being one of the key unlocks of these data focused DAOs in DeSci can definitely prove to be a breakthrough for the research space as a whole, right? So you also spoke about the distributed storage networks, and more broadly talking about the decentralized physical infrastructure networks. There are GPUs, there are networks for compute, there are networks for energy and storage. Broadly, how are you viewing the space? Because we are seeing a few interesting models kind of pop up. There is a more consumer-oriented approach that we see with the likes of Helium, which feels a lot more approachable, maybe. And then there are more sophisticated distributed networks like Akash or Jensen, which seem to have the requirement for more expensive specialized hardware. So how are you um, classifying the space on the basis of, let's say, the sectors and then also the barrier to entry?
Like kind of broader point I would make about this is just a little bit about what we kind of were speaking about before the call when I mentioned like I'm not kind of a decentralization for the sake of decentralization. Like that to
Yeah.
me, it doesn't make sense. Like the way we think about things is, okay, is there a reason that a distributed network or a distributed system makes more sense for these types of problems? And so like, are there latent assets that are not being used that we could use? And so like that drastically brings down the cost of something, or that drastically increases the supply of, for example, GPUs. And so like that to us is why we've always kind of thought distributed compute, distributed storage, more recently distributed energy networks are super interesting, right? Because you have, look, especially, I don't want to like get too much into like the meme of AI, but like you obviously have these giant models that are just getting bigger and bigger. They're sucking up tons of GPUs, right? Like there's chip shortages. Everybody like that's incredibly in demand today, right? And so our view is kind of, okay, what are the resources that are not necessarily being used that we could unlock through a distributed network? Yeah, I know, like you mentioned, Helium, Jensen, like they're doing certainly interesting things. Helium's always been interesting to me, but again, like I'm not sure that those GPUs are like the most in demand or will be the ones that they tap into. And so it's certainly interesting. We haven't made any investments in that particular space yet. We try to talk to everybody who's doing stuff there because we do think like it's one of the areas where it's very clear to us distributed versions of that are much better than centralized versions of it because of cost or because of uptime or just because of balancing like supply and demand. And so, yeah, that those are spaces that are, yeah, certainly stuff that we want to talk to more people who are trying to build projects there for sure.
Got it. I think that's a really interesting framework right there to perhaps be looking at these physical infrastructure networks, right? Does distributing these networks have a major difference on, let's say, this uptime that you spoke about? And as a nature of geographical distribution as well, are there any upsides of having such infrastructure, managing flexible supply and demand? I think these are very good tools for anybody out here trying to evaluate these physical infrastructure networks.
Like we have been spending more time on the energy side because I think just like generally we're seeing, at least in the United States, the grid getting more and more volatile. And so to us, or at least like our kind of working thesis is, look, grid volatility is obviously bad, right? And so like the important thing over time will be actually smoothing out volatility, not necessarily like stuffing energy into more centralized systems. And so if we think that smoothing energy grid volatility is more important, then it's like, how do we think about resiliency of the grid and like better matching supply and demand and avoiding kind of like blackouts and grayouts that we've seen increasingly happening in the United States over the last couple of years. And so like distributed energy to us is like another example of, hey, there's going to be more and more renewable energy coming on the grid, whether it's because of investing in the space or it's because the government is incentivizing it through tax credits, or it's just like the environmentalism behind it of like, hey, like fossil fuels bad, renewable energy good. And so those types of things, like smoothing volatility is uniquely enabled by having way more nodes versus like a couple centralized providers. And so if you can, have distributed batteries or solar panels or wind that can kind of sell back into the grid during periods of peak demand, and you just have like much more flexibility. That's like extremely interesting to us, and energy markets are obviously massive, which is another reason why it's something that we're looking at, and that's just like very clearly a use case for these types of networks and like crypto rails. To us, it's like, again, not a question of like if, but really when. And so, yeah, that's a space that we've been spending certainly a lot of time in recently, which again is like, I don't know. I get kind of like side eye looks when other investors in crypto ask me like what I think is interesting or what we're looking at, because it's it's kind of like, I don't know. It seems I guess a bit out there, but I don't know. That's just, yeah. I mean, that's like we kind of build that thesis, and then we look for people who are building stuff adjacent to that. So
Yeah. No, I really like that, because I think you also paint a picture of there being, these mini network states or micro networks being set up, which probably could be entirely self-sustainable off the grid, having their own energy network within their ecosystem to perhaps trade within the community, and things like that. So it's really exciting, that primitive as a whole. Obviously, I would like to kind of talk about Compound a little bit more. How do you look at, how do you evaluate investments? More specifically, how do you evaluate founders, so to speak? And then it would be awesome if you could shed some light on the characteristics that you look for as Compound when looking to invest in some of these projects.
absolutely. So for us, I think we have because we're a small team, we have 4 on the investment team. It's very, I would say, it's like a very fluid process. Generally, because of the way we invest, where we've been thinking about these different verticals or these different theses for usually a long time, we have kind of developed views on like how we think companies should be built, or like what we think are important things to be considering. And so our view is kind of like, hey, when we talk to teams and we talk to founders, again, it's more like, what do we need to believe versus what do we need to know, right? It's the earliest stages. And so there's obviously going to be like tons of uncertainty. There's going to be technical risks or regulatory risks or science-driven risks. Like those things will exist, and that's just kind of part of investing at early stage. But when we talk to founders and teams, like one of the things I think we look for right off the bat is kind of like, are these people intellectually honest? Like, are they curious? Are they humble? Right? I don't expect founders and teams to know everything, obviously, and so it's like, hey, do I think these people have kind of like the grit and the intellectual honesty to be able to navigate the idea maze as they're trying to figure out what this project looks like? What's the best approach? Are they thinking about product sequencing and, hey, these are the first customers we think matter, and like this is why, and if we can get these customers, then the next set looks like this for these reasons, right? And so it's more kind of depth of thought, and like, do they have nuanced views on the space that they're trying to build? And then I would say the other thing is kind of, how are they measuring success in the super short term? Like, are they thinking about those things? Are they thinking, hey, this is what we care about over the next 6 months, and like this is why we care about it, and this is how we're trying to measure like our success against it? And then like the other part is, okay, what is the big vision, right? So what are you thinking about in the super short term? But also like, hey, if this is a success, like what's your grand vision years down the line? Like, what do you want this thing to look like? And obviously, like the grand vision, it's almost definitely not going to look like that, right? Because just the world changes over the time that you're building these companies. But it's important for us that like these founders are ambitious and they have these big visions, and like they're motivated to like build towards kind of this North Star. And so I think, at least personally, I care most about kind of that initial next couple of months, and then also like the end state, right? Things are going to change along the way. And do I think these people are the right people to navigate like what will definitely be not linear paths to those goals?
I think that's that sort of echoes the way even we tend to evaluate early stage founders, grit and, basically just showing up being one of the most important criteria that we kind of track. But I think that's a really good summarization of what founders can kind of, take away from that, and how can they be approaching an investment conversation with you.
Yeah, I think
So
it's
yeah,
also useful to like you appreciate, look, you're not going to know everything. Like we don't expect them to know everything, but
yeah.
are they like reaching out to people who know more about specific areas? Like, are they like asking us, hey, what do you think about these things? Like, do you have people in your network that we can talk to? Like, I think that founders should be using their investors, right? They're there for a reason, right? They should be more than capital in our opinion. And so like we don't do a ton of check writing because we think it's important to actually work with the founding teams and like have the bandwidth to support them. And so like I do think founders should be proactive about like asking for help or asking for more than just capital from their investors.
No, we definitely advocate for that as well, right? Like we often ask investors as well, as in any kind of grow our network to help founders. We ask them, what is your value add as an investor, and we really enjoy kind of hearing some of the answers, and it helps us even match some of these founders more effectively. So yeah, I think for the final section of the conversation, I would move to some of the audience questions that we've gotten. And even as a part of the registration process, I have a bunch of questions that came in for you. But I think one question that I'll just take right off the bat, and it was only a matter of when and not if when this question would pop up. Looking at the Ripple announcement that came in yesterday, how do you think it will impact fundraising for teams and even VCs? And maybe even more broadly, how have you seen the market react to regulatory clarity coming in and going out as you kind of as time passes?
Yeah, obviously, I think it's great news for the space. Look, my sense kind of on the regulatory front has always been, look, it's the United States has definitely been detrimental to their kind of like really to their own detriment of shunning the space or like not making clear what can and can't be done here. And so I just have always had an overarching view of like, look, for as disjointed, the US political system has been, I think that there's definitely a sense from them that like I've always viewed the more Hong Kong opens up to crypto, the better it actually will be for the United States. Because my personal view is just, look, the United States, for all of the things it gets wrong, I think there's a lot of people in DC who will see Hong Kong open up to crypto and their knee-jerk reaction will be, well, we don't want it to get built over there, we want it to get built here. And so I view it as like that's an impetus for people in DC to get meaningful, like constructive regulation and rules in place here. And so the Ripple announcement, look, I think it just gives more institutional capital here in the US clarity that like that this will be an investable asset class for them. I mean, that's obviously massive when you think about the BlackRocks of the world, like Fidelities, all these huge Vanguards, like all these huge institutions with tons of capital. It's just that to me will ultimately flow to some degree into our space. It's just a matter of when. And so for them, I think it's always been, even when I talk to these people, it's like very often the first question I get is like, oh, you're US based, like what can you guys do? Because I think it's unclear from the people managing these big institutional like capital bases. The uncertainty is just like a cloud that prevents them from doing stuff. And so like they want exposure to it and they have to wait until they get like the thumbs up. And so I think this is just kind of like the first step in, or another step towards those gates opening. And so I think you'll see more capital flow into the space over time. You know, it'll take an annoying amount of time. I think like everybody is like, why can't this just happen today? It'll take longer than people want, but it's to me, it's clear that the US will, it's not like be banning this, and maybe takes a couple iterations of bills going through the House and Senate, but yeah, definitely a good sign definitely bullish for the space, in my opinion, in the United States. And so I think you see Europe has been much more accommodating. And so, yeah, I don't know, I kind of worry less about the regulatory side today. But to your point, just to kind of like put a cap on it, it was certainly something that people have asked about over the last couple of months. How do you operate in this space with regulatory uncertainty? Are you seeing teams move outside of the United States? Are you seeing teams not want to build stuff, specifically in DeFi, because they're worried about regulation? And so I think it's just like the start of like this cloud kind of getting out from under this regulatory overhang that's existed for a bunch of years at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really appreciate that answer. And I think another question from Alex here is, how do you think about fundraising for pre-token protocols versus post-token protocols? Yeah, I guess that's a question out there.
Yeah, so I'd say like typically we invest in both equity and tokens. And so because we're generally, at least on the crypto side, kind of like first, second check, a lot of times that's done in the form of like a SAFT. And so I personally, a question I always ask founders is, how interested are you in decentralizing this? Like, what is your view of whether this project should or should not be decentralized? Do you feel like you're going to need a token? They may not know. And it's like, hey, we put in, token warrants just in case we have one, but we don't think we'll have one. I'm always interested to hear, what their perspective is, because again, this is back to decentralization for the sake of it. I don't feel that most things need tokens, which I don't know, maybe that's controversial. I get why they exist. I find it a little bit perverse when you think about like, what are we here to do? We're here to kind of like build over multi-year time periods with founders and with founding teams. And so the curse of tokens is that you get liquidity much quicker generally. And that's a function of, the funding environment. Are other investors going to have shorter lockups and be interested in getting liquidity quicker? And our view is kind of like, hey, we want to be locked up for as long as possible with you, building for multiple years. Like 6-month like cliffs, a token unlock, like that stuff is just fundamentally not the right way to be doing this. And I just don't kind of agree with that approach. And so, yeah, my general view is like, most times we don't need a token, or like the project doesn't need a token, but I am always interested in hearing what founders and teams think about it, because one thing I will say is like oftentimes, or sometimes, I think that the founder, the team thinks that I asked that because I want the token and like, hey, what do you think about it? But that's not why I'm asking. I'm more asking because I want to hear if they've thought about it. Have you thought deeply about whether that even makes sense?
I mean, there's a lot that I would want to kind of talk about, even on that simple note. And Smac, as expected, an hour is very short to have a conversation with you. But I think, like for final closing notes, can you tell us about, let's say, a founder who's looking to kind of get started on their fundraise? How can they connect with you? How can they connect with Compound? Any closing notes or any remarks that you would like to kind of, end the conversation on?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with myself or us at Compound is either Telegram or Twitter or email. So I can send you those. My Twitter is 0xSmac. And my Telegram is Smac0x because they don't let you start with a number. So that's probably the best way. I'll include like, our Compound website and our crypto website, so that for like the post notes. But yes, yeah, I would just say like DM me, message me. I'm always happy to talk to people building, even if you're unsure and it's just like, hey, I'm interested in crypto, I'm working at a crypto company, but I'm thinking about, starting my own, or, I have this idea. Like, I'm always down to chat through all of those things, whether you're raising or just thinking about stuff. So those are the easiest. I can also include my email. It's up to like whatever medium is best for founders. And I would just say like, one of the other things that I always recommend, I know you mentioned that like you have potentially people who are interested in being analysts and researchers is, as well as founders, is just like, I think people should be working in public as much as they can, whether that's writing about what you think is important, writing about areas you're interested in, whether it's like sharing ideas. Hey, I'm thinking about like something that should be built in crypto specific to this, or like in this space, or like, hey, why don't people build XYZ? I just think doing that in public is just, it's really the best way, because it forces you to kind of find gaps in your own knowledge and like really express what you view. And the more specific, the better. But again, yeah, you get really useful feedback too from people, which is something that I do think is rare in crypto. Like, people are very accessible, which is not the case in a lot of other industries still. And hopefully that remains the case. But like, my sense is as the space gets bigger and bigger, that becomes less and less true. But you know, everybody on this call and listening to this is here now. So it's like, I would just take advantage of that when you can. DM people who you think are like smart, or you want to hear what they have to say, like cold outreach.
I mean,
do all of those
yeah,
things.
that's exactly how we became friends, right? Like, and everybody, if you are a founder looking to raise, I think you should definitely be talking to Compound. Smac is one of the warmest guys in the industry that I've spoken to. He's really welcoming. So yeah, please reach out and do read A Crypto Future. We linked it in the Telegram group as well. We'll post it in the show notes. Thank you for doing this with us, Smac. It was an honor. Really appreciate you taking the time out for this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.